Most business owners still think podcast sponsorship is just about a logo, a shout out, or a nice brand play. But the right local podcast sponsorship can actually help your business build trust faster, reach the right local audience, and multiply your content across platforms. And it can even strengthen how your brand shows up in Google, YouTube, and AI search. Today, we're going to talk about how your brand or business can sponsor a local podcast to help you get brand awareness, authority, and trust built into your marketing channels, and how video podcast sponsorship helps your business get ranked on traditional search engines like Google, as well as answer engines like ChatGPT and Gemini. Welcome to San Antonio Podcasting, the voice-driven ecosystem powered by local podcast shows, creative spaces and studios, expert guest insights, and where local businesses and brands amplify their authority through video podcasting. I'm Matt Nelson with Peachtree Rose Marketing, where we focus on content marketing like video podcasting to help brands, businesses, and personalities show up with authority in front of the right local audience. In today's episode of San Antonio Podcasting, I'm going to talk about the power of video podcasting sponsorship and why every business should at least consider sponsoring one or more local podcasts, even if they have their own podcast. A few common podcast sponsorship questions we're looking to answer in this episode. How can a business borrow trust from a podcast host through sponsorship? What is a parasocial relationship? How does podcast sponsorship offer hyper-targeted marketing for local audiences? How does sponsoring a podcast show create omni-channel marketing opportunities for a local business? And how can sponsoring a podcast help a business show up on Google, YouTube, and AI search results? Now let's get into it. When considering sponsoring a local podcast, people usually ask, how can my business borrow trust from a podcast host through podcast sponsorship? And to answer this question, we really need to dive into this. What is a parasocial relationship, and why does it matter for podcast sponsors? A parasocial relationship is when an audience member feels personally connected to a media personality who does not actually know them individually, or a one-way relationship built over time. We usually see this in the type of relationships formed with TV actors, podcast hosts, and radio personalities, as well as social media influencers or content creators. So why does a parasocial relationship matter for podcast sponsorship? It's simple, because the sponsor is not starting from zero. A business gets to piggyback off of the know, like, and trust factor that the podcast host has already built and is actively building over time. Now, this generally offers instant credibility, especially when the delivery of the sponsorship message comes directly from the host's own words. Now, it's one thing to offer up brand recognition in the written show notes of a podcast, have a logo or a banner placement, or even a high-end commercial as a pattern interrupt during the show. But it's a completely different ballgame and more psychologically powerful when a podcast host says directly to their audience why they would prefer to do business with a brand, which is why making sure there is an actual alignment between a podcast host and a podcast sponsor is so important. Because you want this brand mention to be as genuine as possible, both for the benefit of the marketing strategy itself, as well as the trust the audience has already built with the host. The host needs to believe in the message and the brand to be able to pull this off. And that's how the parasocial relationship plays into the world of building credibility for podcast sponsors. Now, I know for those of you who like numbers or business bottom lines, talking marketing psychology in terms like parasocial relationships can seem a little bit more theory-driven and less practical. So let's offer up some real-world numbers and statistics specifically related to podcast sponsorship. According to IAB's 2024 podcast guide, BetterHelp saw a 40% increase in the return on ads spent, or the ROAS, for the comedy podcast Two Bears, One Cave, due to the host-read ads on the show. This kind of huge marketing win is directly attributable to the halo effect of trust listeners place on media personalities like podcast hosts, and it's a perfect example of a parasocial relationship put to work in a marketing channel. Another common question, how does podcast sponsorship offer hyper-targeted marketing for local audiences? Podcast sponsorship allows a business or a brand to tap into a niche community or an audience that is hyper-targeted in three different ways: geography, psychographics and interests, and trust. Think about it like this. You could pay between $3,000 and $15,000 to run print-based every-door direct mail to send postcards to a few local zip codes, which gives you some geographic targeting. But you have to ask yourself, how many people in each of those zip codes and routes are my ideal customer or my target customer? How many are looking for and willing to transact with my product or service? Effective marketing is all about targeting the right ideal customer and building trust quickly. And when you can align with a marketing partner like a podcast host, you can inherit access to their local network of ideal clients with ease. This is why it's so important to make sure that your product or service aligns with the podcast's given target audience to ensure that you're maximizing this focused opportunity. So let's talk about these 3 ways sponsoring local podcasts help hyper-targeted marketing efforts. Geography. Local podcasts tend to attract a meaningful concentration of viewers and listeners in the host city or the region where the show is recorded. Psychographics and interests. Similar to social media, viewers and listeners self-select into a podcast show that resonates with them based on subjects that they actually care about, making these audience members more qualified than any other random local impression. And lastly, but most importantly, trust. For any advertisement journey, trust is an important factor. Podcast audiences have built-in trust with local hosts. IAB reports that more than 85% of podcast listeners enjoy hearing host-read ads, which help explain why this marketing channel can feel less disruptive and more relevant. Another common question, how does sponsoring a podcast show create omnichannel marketing opportunities for a local business? Sponsoring a podcast can create an omnichannel marketing opportunity for a local business because the sponsorship itself can live in far more places than just the full-length episode. Edison Research published The Infinite Dial 2025, showing 51% of Americans aged 12 and up watched a podcast. 73% have consumed a podcast in either audio or video formats, and 48% have both watched and listened to a podcast. They also found that YouTube is the service used most by 33% of U.S. weekly podcast listeners. Now, this just goes to show you that podcast sponsorship can reach both audio feeds and video versions of a show, immediately expanding reach. A common method many video podcasters use to get even greater reach and attention to their full-length episode is by promoting their content on vertical short-form video platforms like YouTube Shorts, Instagram and Facebook, as well as TikTok, LinkedIn, and others. Text-based content spread across these various platforms, including podcast platforms like YouTube, can turn a single host-read mention in the episode into brand mentions that are spread across multiple channels through searchable text. And it doesn't stop there. Depending on the type of sponsorship, you can actually work with the podcast to help them dual promote via email newsletter mentions, live events, and community tie-ins. In essence, the right type of podcast sponsorship can actually create multiple touchpoints with the same audiences faster than paid ads on platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Google, or other social media, rivaling traditional local influencer marketing. All of this omnichannel presence is powerful from a marketing and distribution standpoint on its own, but here's why it gets even more interesting for businesses and brands. Because your podcast sponsorship starts showing up across audio, video, social media, email, and community touchpoints, you're not just getting more exposure. You're creating something far more durable than traditional ad impressions. You're seeding the digital landscape with searchable digital assets, which brings me to my favorite benefit of podcast sponsorship. How can sponsoring a podcast help my business show up in Google, YouTube, and AI search results? Podcast sponsorship helps search visibility on traditional search engines like Google and Bing, while also creating durable digital assets and artifacts that search engines and AI search engines can read, index, and connect to your brand. Now, this usually happens in 5 layers. Contextual brand mention in the episode itself, brand mention in titles, descriptions, and show notes, captions and transcripts that convert spoken word into written text, links from episode pages or descriptions on your website, and clips and repurposed content to repeat the association across other platforms. Now, it's important to note, AI search engines like ChatGPT and Gemini don't watch an episode the way humans do. These AI systems rely on machine-readable evidence across the web, including indexed web pages, visible text, links, metadata, and other supporting sources that they can retrieve and cite. In short, podcast sponsorship can help your brand show up in AI search results when it creates public, indexable proof across the web that connects your brand to a specific topic, a place, and a credible source like a podcast host. Ultimately, that's why local podcast sponsorship is worth paying attention to. This is not just about renting attention for 30 seconds. It's about borrowing trust, reaching the right audience, and multiplying your message across platforms while leaving digital assets that keep working for your business and brand long after the episode airs. So if you're a local business owner, the question really isn't whether or not a podcast sponsorship sounds interesting or the right play. The question is whether you're missing out on an opportunity to show up where trust, attention, and discoverability are already being built. And the chances are your competition's already got it in mind. This episode of San Antonio Podcasting is sponsored by Peachtree Rose Marketing, where we help brands, businesses, and personalities use content marketing like video podcasting to resonate with the right target audience on every platform. And if you're curious about what podcast sponsorship could look like for your business, reach out to San Antonio Podcasting to help you identify the right local podcast opportunities and the right sponsorship strategy to match your goals.